This is Johannesburg, the biggest city in South Africa now. And this was Johannesburg in the 1950s. These signs were common all around the city because of a system called apartheid. To understand how apartheid ended, we have to go back to when it started. There were nearly 50 years between the start and the end of the system, and a lot had to change in that time. It was made law by the white government in 1948. It kept black and white people separate from each other and discriminated against black people, which meant they were treated unfairly because of the colour of their skin. Black children didn't get to go to the same schools as white children, and black people weren't allowed to use things in public that white people could, like toilets or even benches. They were told where to live, what jobs to have, and the system worked hard to keep black people poorer than white people. If you stepped out of line from any of the rules, you would be punished with violence and could be put into prison for life. Even though most people in South Africa were black, white people made all the rules, and black people weren't allowed to vote. This meant the government got to keep the racist rules in place for a long time. Lots of people protested against the apartheid government, including a political group called the African National Congress, or the ANC. In 1960, the government banned the ANC completely. Around the world, there were protests against South Africa. In 1964, the country wasn't allowed to take part in the Olympics, and this continued until the 1990s. Even though it was banned, the ANC continued to protest against the government. In 1964, a black man called Nelson Mandela was put into prison for life. He had been in charge of the ANC, and lots of people wanted him to lead the country. The government banned pictures of Nelson Mandela and even made speaking his quotes in public illegal. Over the next 20 years, there was lots of pressure on the South African government from inside and outside the country to release Nelson Mandela. A new president, F.W. de Klerk, took over in 1989, and the government was slowly starting to remove some of the racist rules of the apartheid system. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was freed from prison. There were celebrations around the world, and it was broadcast all over the news, including here at Newsround.
Hello again, and there's just one story dominating the news today. It's been the first full day of freedom for Nelson Mandela, the man who until yesterday was probably the world's most famous prisoner.
However, over in South Africa, there was still lots of work to do. 3 years later, black and white people in South Africa got to vote in an election to decide who would be in charge of the country. The ANC won, and Nelson Mandela was made president. 30 years on, there are lots of questions about whether there has been enough progress since the end of apartheid. Black people are still more likely to be poor and without a job, and less likely to do things like go to university. Many people in South Africa say that the ANC have failed to improve things enough. Support for the party has gone down, and they've been accused of keeping money for themselves. The ANC has accepted that they have had problems, and their former leader, Thabo Mbeki, says they will fix the ANC. There has been massive change in the country since Nelson Mandela took over in 1994. However, lots of people still remember what life was like under the apartheid system.